If you work at that regional level and that's all you don't know what it's like to be down in the weeds. There's no such thing as average. So in some ways it's a thankless job because you could do 1,000 things right and that's it. No one sees the 1,000 things you do right. COVID was, I guess, a lesson for the world.
Ever since I've met you and known you, you've been extremely passionate about emergency management as a whole, response work, preparedness work.
If the power stays on and you can turn your tap on, then there's not really an emergency, is there? There's a weather event.
Well, there are two things that I wanted to talk about today. One is, I guess, your area of work in terms of what you specialize in, what you're currently doing. And the other one is the overall, I guess, perspective of what is happening with AF8 and the Alpine Fault as well. Because I know you all down there are heavily involved in that, and it'll be good to hear, exactly what's going on, what's happening. Because it seems as though if we're not in the circles, we don't hear, what planning or whatever's going on. So that will be good. But before we begin, I wanted to ask, you said something last time which stuck with me. Why did you say that you're a sucker for punishment? And what did you mean by that?
It might be reflective of the Southern team. We've been quite short-staffed for a while, and we're a very small team anyway. There's only 7 people when there's a total team, and so when you lose 1 or 2, at one stage there I think we had about 3 staff. So you're still trying to do a lot of the work, and because you've got a finger in every pie is asking you for things, or if they don't see you, then they're like, oh, they're not doing anything, not realizing how much of a reach emergency management has into every sector, I guess, and that you're doing the best that you can. But also, in some ways, which is probably reflective of the media as well, over the last couple of years all across New Zealand with the events, there's a lot of good people doing a lot of good work, but when there's an event, it's very easy for, I guess, the broader population to go, well, that didn't work and that wasn't done right. So in some ways it's a thankless job because you could do 1,000 things right and that's it. No one sees the 1,000 things you do right because they went right. So it's when you maybe didn't get something quite right, or people don't understand how the systems work, so it didn't look like it went right when it went as good as it could. So yeah, I say sucker for punishment for that. There's a lot of people working really hard, but sometimes you don't feel like you're getting anywhere.
Yeah, I can totally agree and understand. It's similar in our line of work, as it sits within your area, but from, I guess, a different perspective. So just before we get into what you actually do specifically and the area you work, could you just give, because we'll have quite a few listeners, could you just give everyone a broad understanding of what is meant by when we use the term emergency management and what comes within that?
Covers quite a lot. So emergency management is, as lots of people knew it as civil defence, I guess back in the day. It's a combination of, but emergency management is, I guess, New Zealand's emergency management system. So whenever something's outside what normal emergency services can handle, or needs to have a really good coordination behind the scenes to support them in their work, that's where we come in. And emergency services, of course, you always see them in response. But when something gets larger, they're still attending to things, but the welfare of people is often where civil defence comes in. So, you can shut roads and you can, I'll say, put out fires. Obviously, it's really big wildfires that we would deal with, where FENS can ask people to leave a dangerous situation, but then where do those people go? Or if there's flooding, you'll have services shutting roads and your critical infrastructure out there working. But again, where do you put those people and how do you look after them? So that's often where civil defence comes in for the care of people, but also to try help people with that. We're also trying to prepare them for that so that they can look after themselves if they can stay at home, or if they can, pop over a couple of suburbs to their auntie's house that the auntie's prepared to take them, etc. So yeah, it's really that preparedness space to be ready for things, and then the looking after them when things go wrong.
Yeah. So one thing that we know of, especially in emergency management, that is often drilled in, is something called, that sits within the 4 Rs. Could you just briefly talk to each one in terms of what they are and what happens within um, each area of those 4 Rs?
Yep. So reduction's quite broad. It's civil defence, emergency management doesn't necessarily work 100% in the risk reduction space because a lot of that's already done by councils and laws that are in place. So things like the Building Act, Coastal Act, we're probably more the smaller parts of very simple things like at home. Your risk reduction would be securing bookshelves to the walls and that sort of thing so that the damage within your space is minimised. Readiness, by large, the readiness space is where we work. So that's talking to people about being prepared for an event, thinking of the extra things like their medication and how much food they have in their house. In this day, with technology the way it is, especially for younger ones that are used to having cell phones at hand, it's getting people to have a plan if normal services go down and they can't talk to each other on phones. If your power goes out, a lot of our services are really reliable in New Zealand. So people take it for granted that they're always going to work. And it just takes things like we had a high wind event last week and that knocked out power in heaps and heaps of places in Southland for various, sets of time, depending where you were. So yes, how do you cook your food? Can't watch TV, internet's not going to work. How do you check on your friends and family? And we'll also go in and teach at primary schools, to let kids know about, what an earthquake is. We've got a earthquake simulator that we'll put them in so they can experience, so it's not as scary when it actually happens. And we have little groups that will work with the more vulnerable groups, I guess, whether that's older people, people with disability, English as a second language, just to get them a bit more prepared with what their things are they may need to have ready over and above, I guess, the average person, and how to take care of themselves if they have to evacuate or come to a civil defence centre. And then that's sort of like the front of what we do. But behind the scenes, what we do in readiness is we have to have staff ready to help us. We're such a small team. So we train all the council staff how to work in a coordination centre. We work with emergency services. It's really building those good relationships. So if you have to ring someone at 4 o'clock in the morning, they know who they're talking to, and working with all of the critical infrastructure of what's their day to day look like, but how can they be more resilient when things go wrong, and where we may need to coordinate different, critical infrastructure. Roading guys are worried about the roads, telecoms are worried about telecoms, but for us to have to coordinate, actually, we need this road open to turn this power on to make this cell phone tower work. So those sort of coordination things behind the scenes. And then response. Response is what everyone sees on TV. It's actually a very short, sharp part of what we do. That's when all of those relationships really matter. All the work we've done with community to prepare, that how they're going to get through, critical infrastructure, lots of the welfare support agencies. So we have the government agencies like MSD, and then we have the support agencies like Red Cross and Salvation Army, all stepping in together to work together. And then the short sharp that is, which doesn't feel short and sharp to some people, but the short sharp that is then slides into the recovery. And recovery is so, so much longer than a response is. You think places like Christchurch still, aren't 100%. The North Island from Cyclone Gabrielle. So the recovery space can take quite a long time to get through. And it's not necessarily a get back to what is normal, it's get back to what is the new normal and what that looks like. And then all of the work that we do then turns over to the normal services that would normally look after that, be it a council, MSD, MPI, those sort of organisations. And then you take those lessons that you learn during recovery and you roll them into the risk reduction. Should we be building our buildings stronger? Is there a different, should we have flood banks that are higher, or should we have people not live so close to hazards? to start lessening the effects of what the next response is going to look like.
Mm. So usually out of recovery is where new legislation would possibly come
Yeah,
into effect, right?
yeah.
Mm. Goodness, it's a full 360 circle thing that just keeps cycle that needs to be churned again and again and again, and I guess tweaked based on specific events or what has happened to actually strengthen, I guess, the whole system,
Very
really,
much so.
isn't it?
Yes. COVID was,
Yeah.
I guess, a lesson for the world, but,
Mm.
for New Zealand too. That's when I guess they sort of had to make policy on the fly there. Originally, it
Mm.
was a national state of emergency because it was only really the Civil Defence Act that could say, right, you have to stay at home. So then health had to play catch up. So then the next time there were lockdowns, they had ability to do that through their own legislation rather than having to keep calling it a state of emergency through the Civil Defence Act. But
Yeah,
yes,
that was a pretty
Christchurch was
tough
a
time.
reflection on the Building Act as
Mm.
well. So big events do dictate what policy looks like going forward.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, I was thinking about that, what happened through COVID, and yeah, it was a real struggle. I remember talking to a nurse, and she was saying it's just like it seems that we wasn't prepared for an actual pandemic when we should have had things in place for a pandemic, but it's something that just completely went over, and the government didn't
It was
even.
written into plans,
Mm,
like it was in our Southland Group plan as a
yeah.
possibility, along with several other things that could happen as an event. But I think we've also got a very short memory.
Mm,
Last had decent flu pandemic 100 years ago, and so you do start getting complacent about what's the
yeah,
next big thing. And for us, it's often weather.
yeah.
Yes, they had, and who could have seen it coming really? And now we've had it. Chances are high we're going to have more again for how interconnected the world is.
Yes, very, very interconnected, isn't it? So, with your day to day, what is it that you do, and where do you work?
So where do I work? I work at Emergency Management Southland, which is based here in Invercargill. But we cover all of Southland, so up past Milford Sound, down to our east of Gore, and then down to and including Stewart Island as well. So it's the second biggest region.
Mm,
There's 16 regions in New Zealand, but they're largely following sort of the regional council boundaries, give or take. And yes, as mentioned before, we only have a team of 7, so it's a pretty small team. So I actually changed jobs a couple of months ago within the team. And so I'm the principal emergency management advisor now. And majority of my work is the back of house stuff. So working with the emergency services, coordinating all the critical infrastructure, making sure our emergency coordination centres all ready to go. Essentially, we have to be able to just walk in and turn on the lights. So that's making sure your computers are good to go, but also if the power goes out, we've got alternate means of, got a generator. If our computers don't work, well, I should say if our internet doesn't work, we've also got backup internet, that sort of thing. And then I also have a couple of sort of more specialised groups like the Fuel and Hazard Working Group that do more targeted work in places like Milford. And that's just again, agencies behind the scenes, doc, councils, that sort of thing. But because our team's so small, I'll also assist in the public space as well. So it's not unheard of to also see me out at I think what was it? We had a FENS conference
yeah.
where myself and one of the other advisors were talking to all of the fire chiefs from Southland Otago, or I might end up out at a school one day with the team members that teach the kids. So a little bit of everything, varied job.
That could sound, or that not could sound, that sounds quite draining, especially if you've got multiple hats that you're wearing in that space. That sounds quite tiring as well, to be
There's
doing.
pros and cons to being in a little
Yeah.
team. I was just discussing with my teammate today, actually. The con is you don't necessarily feel like you're doing any one thing really well because you are wearing several hats and you've
Yeah.
only got so much time to lend to each group that you're working with. And in some of the bigger teams around New Zealand, there might be someone that does that role as a full-time role, but it's
Mm,
only 10% of your job. That's where you work with those people and that are in those roles, and not reinvent the wheel. If people have got really good procedures and policies, they're happy to share, and we can take what we can use in Southland and make it our own. So that's really good. But the upside of working in such a small team is understanding how all our other small groups work. So I could work quite closely with the group welfare manager on something, and in other regions that might be a full-time job, but because that's also only 10-20% of her job, we can work on things together, and we have an understanding between training, etc., of what we actually need to do. So yeah, so in some ways it saves a bit of work. It stops the silo. The other thing about emergency management in Southland is because we cover the whole region, we're actually covering the local and the regional of everything. So I might know the regional commander for Fens, but I also know the small rural fire chief, working in Bluff. And so you can build those different layers of relationships as well, depending what, the events are or who you've got to contact for what. Whereas in other areas in New Zealand, they'll have local civil defence staff in each of their councils, and then they'll have regional staff in their regional council, and that's another layer that has to communicate with each other when things are going wrong.
It sounds very confusing to an average person, really. I've always found, since I've been here for it's been about 9 and a bit years. One thing I found first is the whole emergency management thing just confused me so much. The different people and the different layers and this and that. And I was just like, oh, goodness me, it's quite strange. It's quite foreign because in the UK, you don't really see it in that way. But understanding, I guess, just the geographical makeup of New Zealand as well, and how volatile the environment is here, it's understandable why you have that in place in the way it is. But it is quite a
Again,
confusing
there's pros and
structure.
cons, right? 16 regions doing it 16 different ways sometimes.
Yeah.
We offer programs in Southland that maybe Otago doesn't do, and they're our neighbours, and vice versa. So yeah, some people I think probably like their local model because they're really down in the weeds with everyone and leave the regional planning to the regional guys. And if you work at that regional level and that's all you don't know what it's like to be down in the weeds. So I guess I enjoy covering both, even though, you're essentially doing half of each. And then the national level, because we're funded by our local councils, essentially our local councils decide what our programs are, how much funding we have. We're not funded centrally like lots of other government departments. And so whether there'd ever be the move to do that. But yeah, nationally they are trying to standardise some things. It's just a bit of a process.
So what would a day, let's just say an average day, look like for you? You're laughing in the sense that I don't really know what it would
I'm
look
laughing
like.
because there's no such thing as average.
Okay, what would a day look like then?
I'll pick last week. Monday we have the team all get together, talk through what we're going to do for the day. Currently training a new person how to be a duty officer. So they're trained up to do 24/7 cover, have turns about on our duty roster. So they have to then be able to put up all of the warnings, etc. Tuesday I had a critical infrastructure meeting. Wednesday, I had to go out to Gore for an emergency services and hospital health meeting with all the contacts in Gore. Wednesday afternoon, I drove up to Tianau. And then Thursday, I was in Milford Sound all day, catching up with critical infrastructure, emergency services, a couple of the operators up there, plus myself and my colleague also erected a whole bunch of tsunami signs that we've been wanting to put in there for some time. And then Friday I come back and did some training with the controllers. So when you go into an event, you have that person in charge. That essentially when a state of emergency is declared, the mayor hands over all authority and power to civil defence for the state of emergency, and the controller is the boss. So we do a training with them once a month, get them all together and go through a few bits. So yeah, so every day something different, meeting with different people, in between times trying to work on operating procedures and all the things that fall out of those meetings. Yeah, what next for critical infrastructure? What programs should we be working on together to be more ready together? You know, so each organisation's ready to handle their own thing, but when it starts getting really big, that's where you have those relationships around the table. You can start pulling in each other before it even gets to a state of emergency, and we can support that. And we might do that 5-10 times before we even go into a state of emergency when it's really escalated.
So a pretty frantic day-to-day for you. You cover you pick up a lot of Ks, don't you, in your
Can
role?
do. Yeah. And I'm not necessarily traveling as much as the team members that are working out in the communities. You know, so we've got over 20 community groups across Southland. So you could be in Tianau, you could be in Gore, you could be in Ethel, you know, popping over to Stewart Island. Yeah. So there's a lot of Ks to cover when you're in the second biggest region.
Yeah. So just on what you just said there about, because you mentioned it a couple of times about your team. What's the makeup of your team currently at the moment? Like, who do you manage or look after in that small team of 7? I think you said it was currently.
Yeah, I don't anymore. I'm kind of an independent now. So I
Ah,
was the team leader up till a couple of months ago,
yeah.
and moving into the principal role is a standalone role so that I can essentially specialize in what I do. Team leader looks after a senior advisor, 2 EM advisors, and the administrator. But because I guess I've not long moved out of the role, and we only become fully staffed this week, because they were my team and I'd written all the plans, etc., for the workloads, and also to assist the team leader while she's covering extra bits until we got our newest advisor this
Mm.
week. And that's why I'm like, we'd cover a little bit of everything. So I'm doing some training with the administrator, and I'll do some training with the new advisor as well. And then we have a manager. So essentially, the team leader and myself report to the manager, who's also our group
Ah.
controller. Yeah.
So you're in the process of doing a handover of
Yeah. Yeah. So
everything.
it's
Yeah.
it's some jobs with team leader, some jobs I guess with Tracy jobs. So we're working out what the team leader should hold, because I had developed the training program and I'd been delivering it, and then I started getting all of the team to deliver it. So now
Mm.
essentially I've got to push that off,
Yeah, and hand it
and then
back.
I can concentrate on my parts a wee bit more. Yeah,
Yeah,
but
and
I'm
really focus
also,
and specialize.
but
Mm.
because I've covered all of the roles, I'm also a handy go-to, because chances are I know the answer.
That's one of the problems with doing your job so well. If you do a job so well, you become that point where everyone diverts. Let's just go and ask Tracy, no, Tracy will know, just go and ask Tracy,
Yeah, there is
which
a
can be
little
a
of
problem.
that. Yeah,
Yeah.
a couple of our staff members are actually returning old staff members, so at least they didn't come in green. But
Yeah.
I've been there 4 years, and the whole rest of the team has joined us in the last year and a half. So there's
So
been a
very
lot of
new.
training and a lot of go-to.
Yeah.
We had a staff member for 14 years who was that guy, so it was a bit of a joke that I'm that guy, even though I don't have 14 years under my belt. It's going to take a wee bit for me to have his knowledge under my belt. But yeah, so a few other staff have returned that have been here with us before. But yeah, we've also got 3 brand new people that have come from outside civil defence, and it takes quite a bit to get up and running with all the different things that we do. So yes,
Oh,
so
so
we're
they're learning the whole system of how it all
yeah,
works. Yeah.
yeah, and they come with their skill sets. But yes,
Yeah.
as you know, being a support agency, you think you've got a good understanding, and then you step into it, and you're like, oh, okay, I understood that slice that I worked in, not realizing how much more there is. Yeah,
Yeah, I remember when I did it was actually in Southland when I did that Sims 4. Man, I was so confused. Because I was with there was a couple of police officers who were there. There was a couple guys from St. John's, and I can't remember who there was a few other guys and a few ladies, and I was just like, goodness me, all what's involved, in the EOC and how this all works and the different roles and all of that. I was just like, it's mind blowing, isn't it? Just all what's involved in that coordination center in terms of how things are coordinated through an emergency. Who needs to know what? Who does what? Who makes the call for this? Who has to get information out here? How this has to be done? And just like,
Yeah.
wow. Yeah, it is. I had a very painful head at the end of that course. So I
Yes,
can understand
that's
how they
one
must
of the
feel.
course we deliver. But
Yeah, I can
I
understand
saw
how they
that
must feel.
lots of people were coming in deer in headlights after that course. So that's why we do a couple of training courses before you get to that course for our council staff. Because if it's
So
not a
it's
field you work
you
in,
ease people now.
it's a lot.
There's a couple of courses that ease
A wee bit
people
more,
into the
yes.
whole system rather than just bang.
Yeah.
They just love to throw us in there and just bang, throw you and go, and you need to do the Sims now. It's just like, oh, no.
Yeah.
It's quite
So
intense
yeah,
though, isn't it?
I put a couple of courses on first because it's no use to anyone if someone comes to a 2-day course and then they just leave going, what was that?
Yeah.
So we do 5 hours training before they get into a 2-day NZQA course, and they come do it at the coordination centre as well, so they actually get a feel for the space, so that if we go into an event and call them up, they've had a minimum amount of training. But also, it's weird to say, but if you've not been there before, it can just seem, overwhelming. Whereas if you've been there once or twice for training courses, you know where the toilets are and where you can help yourself to a coffee and who a few of the faces are, and it doesn't seem quite so scary.
That would have been very helpful to a lot of us before being thrusted into the Sims 4 course. Yeah, because the Sims model in itself is confusing, really, for the average Joe. And a lot of us hadn't worked in emergency management beforehand, and then because you work for a support agency, you then, you need to do this. You need to do that. So yeah, that course that you've developed would have helped beforehand. But there was another thing I wanted to talk to you about, because ever since I've met you and known you, you've been extremely passionate about emergency management as a whole, response work, preparedness work. Where did that interest come from? Like, when did it start to develop for you, and then how did you actually get into the whole emergency management scene?
It's funny because it feels like a life experience thing, and I don't know how much weight to give to each thing really. Like my parents were in the '84 flood. My mum had to evacuate with me, so they'd experienced it. So, just knowing what to do in an emergency for them. I come from an outdoors family, going camping and tramping, being able to live without electricity and running water and cooking on gas and all of that stuff. Some of the work that I've done, I've always worked in like a customer service type role of helping people, and be that something like bar work or retail in the outdoor space. Talking to different kinds of people a lot. And then I went and volunteered with Red Cross for several years, and I guess I wore a few different hats. But I started with Red Cross in the disaster and welfare support team space. And fortunately, or unfortunately, depending how you look at it, fortunately for me, I started in 2009. So we got a couple of years of good training under our belt before the Christchurch earthquakes happened. And it felt quite a defining moment, I guess, working up there. I really thoroughly enjoyed it. I just kept going and going. I'm one of those people who keep going till I fall over. But yeah, a few years after, I went up to Christchurch and went down one of the streets that I'd worked on, and I could still go down the street and go, this person, this house was a family with small children, and this house was elderly people, and this house, and I can't remember what I had for lunch 3 days ago, but to be able to remember a few years later, who all those
Yeah.
people were, it obviously really stuck with me. And then, of course, coming home and going back to your normal job just feels kind of dull at the time. And
Flat.
then it's just, yeah, I think lots of people say they work well under pressure, but it really gives me energy to be in a response and everything's going 150 miles an hour. And sure, you can have 50 things go wrong, but just, you're really working hard to make sure everything's as right as it can be. And just the thought, like I'm a mum, just the thought of kids being scared and people not having anywhere to go and, the cost of living and everything's so expensive. It's really hard for people to get by on a normal day. And so it's like when something goes wrong, it can go wrong really big, for lots of our community. And because of, you know, being a single parent or working part time in a lower paying job, I also know how it is for the regular Joe, I guess, and if you have to evacuate, how scary that is. And, I have a cat, I don't want to leave him at home. So when a job opportunity came up in the community space originally at EMS, I thought, oh, well, yeah, I'll give it a shot. If I don't get it, I'll stay in the job I'm in. But yeah, so I was fortunate I got the job. And I had a couple of surreal moments not long after I was starting. We'd be watching a video about volcanic eruption or something. And I'm like, oh my God, I get paid to do this now. Because I was that nerd that had come home from my day job and watched disaster documentaries or read articles so I've had an interest in it for a long time.
Oh yeah. And now you're pleased that you've got quite a really good role now that you've
Yeah.
shifted roles
Yeah. I've been there
as
4
well.
years. And I think it's technically about my fourth title in the same team. So I've covered the community space, I've covered the response space, I've covered the team leader of the community space. So now I'm in the principal of the response space. Yeah.
Nice.
So a little bit
And
of everything, but gone fast.
yeah. So what are some of the things that you've experienced in that community space? Because from when you was explaining earlier around just, I guess, the overall general um, perspective of what emergency management is and what falls into it, there was a lot that you explained within that preparedness space, which is where I probably have seen from experience and understanding. That's where the bulk of the work is really done, isn't it? In terms of preparing not just individuals, but preparing communities and preparing, I guess, the nation. So what's some of the things that you have done around that community preparedness space in Southland?
Quite a list. Well, with I guess geographically, we've got our community response groups and they've got plans. So I'll pick on anyone, Riverton, right? So Riverton has a community response group. They, within the community, identify places they can go that would be safe. So it might be like Riverton Racecourse that is outside the reach of the tsunami zone. We go practice with the schools out there. All the schools and early childhoods are in the tsunami zone. So we'll practice with them on National Shakeout Day and then do a practice tsunami hikoi. So gather up all the kids, and we don't walk quite as far as Riverton Racecourse. That's a wee way to go. We'll walk up to Bupa and then walk them back. Um, it's working with, rest homes, what their plans are, and, certain things fall under health, but we would also be the support if they needed transport, to move people. Gosh, the shaky trailer, I think I mentioned before, will go into primary schools.
Mm,
And so there's something like 9,000 primary age children in Southland, and we'll take the shaky trailer, but we'll touch on, tsunami. We've got a really big coastline down here and a few big lakes, quite handy, and just general storms, severe weather. You find rural towns
mm,
generally are a bit more prepared. They don't necessarily have a supermarket just down the street. They're more likely to have had power cuts to understand what that means, or maybe some snow for some spots. Invercargill City is a bit harder because all the services here, like turning on the taps and turning on the lights and flushing the toilet, they all work fine most of the time.
mm,
So it's teaching young ones, because if you can teach the primary age kids, we always say when we're wrapping up with them, make sure you go home today and teach the people that you live with, how to drop, cover, and hold, etc. What you learnt today. And then there's lots of little groups. So we'll work with in that sort of community welfare space. lots of agencies that are already supporting vulnerable groups. So you might work with Age Concern that's already supporting older people. We're not in a position to run everything because there's only 7 of us, right? So you want to support the agencies that are already doing that really good day-to-day work, but make sure that you have a relationship with them because you're going to need to depend on them, but also that they can ring us and go, hey, look, we've identified this big pocket of people, or we've got these people here and no resources. And yeah, I can't think, I'll probably keep saying it. It's all the relationships you have built. And then in that readiness space, the behind the scenes with the critical infrastructure. You know, if the power stays on and you can turn your tap on, then there's not really an emergency, is there? There's a weather event. But if everyone can stay in their homes and still have food and all the rest of it, there's no welfare response. So we're not really needed. Something like, I guess, COVID that shut the schools. You know, a lot of schools provide lunch in schools. And for a lot of families, that meal, you know, for the children's important. They're doing the rest of their groceries around that. So when all the schools shut, families were then like, we don't have enough food. You know, we can't see out the week. So it's for those vulnerable groups, especially. I mean, obviously, an event affects everybody, and I don't want to pick on. It sounds very stereotyping, picking on people like lawyers and doctors, etc. But I'll go with people with means will be affected, but then they kind of right themselves reasonably quickly if you've got support or funds that if you've evacuated you can still go buy some, you know, another set of groceries or whatever. And then you've got people that either don't have means or they don't have support, and so you all have families that take in their other families, but between them, you know, they don't necessarily have enough food to support each other. So we find in the longer term, you know, even from the start of a response, the average Joe will write themselves, but the people that are maybe already struggling a bit day to day will need actual support for us a bit longer. And then when it starts going into recovery, you know, perhaps they'd need some further support from likes of the MSD.
Yeah, one thing I have started to notice working with a number of, I would say, local community groups and individuals is how unprepared a lot of people actually are. And I was just wondering, from your experience and what you have seen, how prepared do you think, let's just take in Southland, because we can't really talk about the whole country, how prepared a number of communities actually are, especially in Southland? And do you think there's a lot more work that needs to be done to actually get it into the forefront of, I guess, people's minds? Because events are inevitable here in New Zealand. It's not something that we think, oh, it might happen, or, you know, it is going to happen, as we know, right? So what have you seen so far with the level of preparedness within communities? Is it a lot? Is it a little? Like,
I should know the numbers off the top of my head. Our comms person will kill me. I want to say 43% have a plan. We do an annual survey to ask lots of these questions to find out. But then that's also the people that know what emergency management is are also the people more likely to do an emergency management survey, right? So is it a true indication of how prepared people are? We won't know. It can be a real spectrum. You find people that have already been in an event. So I've struck many people down here that used to live in Christchurch. And so they'll see you and they'll see the logo and they'll be like, oh, I've got to check my food or I've got to check my water. So they will have things stored. Having been through an event is very much an indicator of those people have got some preparedness because they know, right? And then you go all the way to the other end where some of it could be education, some of it is, oh, you'll get the people that are like, oh, you're just scaremongering for things like climate change, etc. And then, unfortunately, which is my own opinion, not an EMS opinion, I think there's an element of the government will look after us because through COVID, you know, there was all the payments through COVID and big support systems set up for food parcels, etc. So I think it's a we don't have to, because they will help us. And then there's ones I think that would genuinely like to, but they just don't have the means. And then everyone kind of sits on a spectrum in the middle, whether they know it or not. So you do a weekly shop, great. You've got a weekly shop plus maybe some extra bits in your cupboard. For people that live out rurally, they might only do a fortnight or longer, or they might, you know, take a beast to the butcher, so they've got a month worth of meat in their deep freeze. So it really depends. Um, and that's the hard thing about how varied it can be. And we say to people, if you can look after yourself, please do so, because then
Mm,
we can target our resources to those that can't, for whatever reason, look after themselves. But it's not unless you've had an event. So you think somewhere like the
mm,
West Coast South Island, they have severe rain warnings all the time. Like, they have heaps of flooding, and so their communities are much more prepared. They know
mm,
to keep an eye on each other. They've got extra provisions like Starlinks in each community and caches of things to be able to look after themselves when the roads are cut, because they're pretty much expecting it, because it happens so often.
mm,
For Southland, we did have a bit of a weather thing. We've had a couple of wee things that haven't ended up in a state of emergency, and we've just managed it behind the scenes. Last state of emergency, Southland wide, was September 2023. And even then, it was very short lived. It was essentially 2.5 days of flooding. And while some areas were more affected than others, the main state highways, weren't shut for long, etc. Groceries still got through, power and water was still working. And then before that was the 2020 floods, which was
mm,
considerable flooding across Southland. Mostly it was Milford Sound that we
mm,
evacuated, so that was a lot of tourists. And Gore, funnily enough, but either side of our region had quite a lot of flooding, and people in Gore, Matara Way, some of them were out of their houses for quite some time, but it was quite localised.
mm,
So we haven't had a Cyclone Gabrielle size event down in Southland for a long time. And so I think with that and the day-to-day pressure and life stress of you're just trying to get through, it almost seems like it's like insurance. I say we like
mm.
insurance. No one really necessarily likes insurance. And you should have it, you should get round to it, but sometimes you just don't, and then something happens
Yeah,
and you wish you had.
yeah.
So we're kind of that insurance thing. People will do the health and safety stuff at work, but that's today, right? They're not looking ahead. So, lots of people are short staffed, or staff are under pressure. They don't
Mm,
want to have to go, well, now we have to plan for, if something goes wrong with the business. They don't think that could be today. So it gets pushed back.
mm. Do you think there's more that can be done to, I don't know if educate's the right word, but create more awareness of the vulnerabilities in New Zealand out towards communities that it can be quite volatile here in the country, looking and seeing what's happened through the years, like Christchurch, like out with Cyclone Gabriel, like even just before Cyclone Gabriel, the northern floods and adverse weather up there. It was like two massive hits at the beginning of that year. Do you think there's more that can be done, or do you think a lot of people live in such a state of comfortability, and the fact that they don't experience these things, that they're just like, oh well, I'll deal with it when it comes to it, type thing.
I I do think there can be more done. A lot of it comes down to funding for us
Mm,
too, though. If you've only got 7 staff, um, where do you target? But how many
mm,
staff do you have or need to do this targeted work? Because we're funded by the Southland ratepayers, so they want to know what they're paying rates for is being used well.
mm,
Are you better to spend more money on flood banks? So there's or pest control, or roads or three waters. Like, where do councils have to decide to put their money to ensure the running of their town or their region? So we're just a piece of that. Plus, we work in boundaries as well, regional boundaries, and things like rivers don't follow boundaries necessarily. So it's also working with the next region over, and they might have double the staff or triple the staff. It depends what
Yeah.
their ratepayer base is and how much their council wants to dedicate to it. So it can be a bit haphazard across New Zealand how much money is spent where. And for some regions that do spend a bit more money, you can see it in their preparedness. Auckland's got 1.5 million people. They proportionately don't have the same amount of staff as we do, but they have caches of supplies that we don't. So, yeah, it's decision making at the top for how much of a priority civil defence is given across New Zealand, whether there's a central funding model added, whether you can apply for extra funding, whether it's a ratepayer base, and how much rates. No one I'm a ratepayer. No one likes paying high rates, right? But
No, we don't up here as well. It's ridiculous.
yeah, how many staff do you get out of that part of the kitty? There can be targeted education programs, but again, it's if people want to, because you can put up signs and put out ads and have websites, and if people aren't going to go look, they're not going to go look. So yeah, so it's a really hard thing to quantify. I would love people to be so much more prepared. The idea is do us out of a job, right? But I think, yeah, when you don't have a whole lot of events all the time,
Yeah.
people have got bigger worries to worry about. Yeah, and just go, oh, we'll worry about it if it happens, not when it happens. We'll worry about it if it happens. Yeah.
Yeah, I think also it goes back to what you were saying before around working with the different community organizations, in a sense of you really becoming I guess, a support overarching group to those local community organizations, because there's a lot of work that they can actually do because they're actually working with the people on the ground and they know the needs within those communities, and they can actually develop programs or activities that create that awareness in these small pockets of communities that, in a sense, create mini champions of preparedness and what to do in emergencies as well. And that's one area that I saw where civil defense can work really well, is, I guess, enabling and supporting those small local community groups, because they're really in the thicket of it, aren't they?
Yeah. And that's very much what we try to do at that local level. Probably a good example, it was a good story. There was someone working, she was actually working at a council, but her program was funded by a trust, and the program was to work with the older people in the community. So she had various things she had to do with them, maybe get them first aid, talk about independent living, and she got us in to discuss preparedness with them. That you're like, well, yeah, what do you buy, Nana? Nana has everything. Oh, well, actually, here you go, Nana. This is what a gas cooker looks like, and here's the freeze dry, but also you can just go get some continental surprise peas from the supermarket. Things
Yeah.
that store long life, and we ended up part of the work that she was doing, we're like, there's still a lot of older people that don't go on the internet. That it's a generation miss now, and all of our information is on our website, and we'll share it on our Facebook. But if you don't go on the internet, we don't do pamphlets and booklets like we used to. And so we recognised, actually, no, let's create a booklet. A
Yeah.
booklet almost like a booklet from the 80s that actually has the information in it without going, now go to this website for all the rest of the information. And so just to give them, yeah, this is how you store your water. Think about your medication. If you are diabetic, have you thought about how you're going to do your insulin and all of those things? So we made a book for older people, and we published that in the Gore area, and everyone liked it so much because we had targeted like the radio stations and everything in it. We published South and Wide, and now there's other regions picking it up as well and going, yeah, something as simple as going back to pen and paper, which is lots of people still just use pen and paper, and or when the internet goes down, you can't jump on and have a look at that list. Working with Red Cross, when they have here in Southland, when the former refugees come to Southland, we will go in and talk to them about preparedness in Southland and talk to them. And you don't want to scare them. They've just got here, and then you're telling them about our hazards. But in lots of ways, it's better to know, so that and understand how New Zealand systems work when there's an emergency like flooding, and how they too could be best prepared. And I've had some laughs. When I talked to a group from the Congolese, and they were saying how they boil water and store water a lot. And I was like, yeah, bring that habit with you. Keep doing that here. And things like just having a few extra packets of rice floating around. So, yeah, there's always a way to identify with people that aren't necessarily from Southland. And disabled groups too will sit at the table with the Disability Network. And it's really interesting hearing their day-to-day issues, but it's also it's so many different groups, whether it's hearing impaired, autistic, trying to understand independent living situations, and how they then, with all of their groups, clients, etc., can maybe have those little one-on-one conversations. And we say about food and water a lot to store, and that can cost, and that's might be the barrier for lots of people. But really, the number one thing is to have a plan. That's free. Do you know your neighbours to talk to? If you can't get home, do you go to your auntie's house across town? But does everyone know that? That that's where you should all go. And you can have that conversation with your family anytime. If the kids are at school and one of you works in town and one of you works out of town, like that it's a given who's going to go pick up the kids and then where are we going to meet. So there is a lot of preparedness you can do without having to spend money. And especially here in Southland, we don't pay for water. So, just take an old Coke bottle and fill it up from the sink and throw it in the garage for 6 months. So I think some people too think preparedness is too hard box. But there's lots of little things that can be done for free or cheap. And a couple of bottles of water is better than not having a couple of bottles of water. It buys you, whether it's hours or a few days, for you to work out what you're doing next. And it makes the event, I guess, less traumatic as well. If you can sit down and play cards because you've got a couple of lanterns, then it's almost fun for the kids. Not, oh no, we can't watch TV or get on the internet. Yeah,
That's one thing that has been developed really well, I feel, with Red Cross and that Good and Ready program. It's just identifying your local hazards, making a plan based on those hazards in terms of what to do, and then sharing that plan. Find a buddy, like you're saying, in your community or your neighbor, and just sharing, this is the plan, this is what we've drawn up on the plan. And then even from that, what would you need? Probably a grab and go bag. And like what you were saying, I was at an event in Eastbourne, out in the bays, Eastern Bays, in the hut in Wellington, and they've got one road access, right? The Bay Road. So it's the minute something happens, they're completely cut off. And one of the Red Cross volunteers, a lady there who's been there for years, she just brought this big plastic container with all of these things in it and started showing the people at this event. So the event had Fens there, it had police, St. John's, a number of people. And she was just showing the different items you can put, so simple, in a rucksack as a grab and go bag for an elderly person, for just a mum and a dad, and also for children. She's like colouring in book, things like this, just like you're saying. It's so simple, but it's actually getting people to that stage of actually just having is, and I think that's the hardest part, right?
Everyone goes, I know I should. Yeah. Yeah, what do you
Yeah.
have around your house? And that's it. If you're in an actual hazardous zone, like a tsunami zone, to be able to grab stuff and go really quickly. If you actually know that you're not too bad, like you're not in a flood zone or not in a tsunami zone, you may still be victim of, you can't, go to the supermarket because the road between Dunedin and Christchurch is cut, like this for us down here in Southland. But knowing your neighbours, there's so many rentals around now. People don't know their neighbour, and people are at work all day. People don't know their neighbours the same as they used to. But just being a bit brave and saying hi over the fence on occasion, so that it's not as hard to be like, oh, you're all right. And I saw it in Christchurch. There was, one house had a barbecue, but they wheeled it out in their cul-de-sac, and everyone shared the barbecue and just took turns getting stuff out of their freezer as things were defrosting, and just ate together for a week, because one person had a barbecue.
Yeah.
So if you do get to know your neighbours a wee bit, then you don't have to have all of the supplies yourself. Maybe you can share, having the different supplies between you all in your wee community group. Yeah.
Yeah, 100%. So preparedness, that's a big thing. And just shifting on from, I guess, preparedness, but moving on to another area, which I assume a lot of preparedness and research is happening, is around AF8, the Alpine Fault. Could you just explain what that actually is? Because we hear the terms
I
thrown
really
out,
like that you
AF8,
say
Alpine
AF8.
Fault.
Yeah, AF8 is actually the name of the program, but it's
Right.
just stuck now. Everyone calls it AF8.
Yeah, that's
So
what I mean.
AF8,
But it's not actually, is
yeah,
it? Yeah.
yeah. So the Alpine Fault is the fault line that runs out at Milford and runs 600, 800 k's up our South Island, and that's what's made our lovely mountains. And it's where the Pacific and the Australian plate meet. And it causes great big earthquakes in New Zealand. And a lot of research has been done on it. I'll say we're fortunate in the way that there's not many places around the world that has tectonic plates on passing through their land, essentially. Lots of them are in the ocean. And so there's been a lot of research done on the Alpine Fault. And they knew that there'd been a few large earthquakes. The research, so they gave us about, I think it was about a 30% chance of one coming to us soon. And then they did some core sampling in some key lakes up the west coast and have realised there was like another 26 odd earthquakes with reasonably alarming regularity. And so over the last 8,000 years, I think there's been like 27 earthquakes about every 300 years, give or take. And so our last one was in 1717. So
So if
yes,
you do
doing
the
the maths,
math,
just over 300 years ago. Yeah.
right.
So there's a 75% chance we are going to have an Alpine Fault earthquake in the next sort of 50 years or so. And while it's a straight line per se, it's actually kind of in 3 sections, they're all joined together. And there might be an earthquake in a section, and that would be not great, but it's not ripping apart, the whole South Island. But they, by the size of the earthquakes, can tell that, if there's about a magnitude 8, that will
Wow.
essentially unzip 400 kilometres odd through those sections and cause quite a reasonable earthquake. So there's been a few different models done of whether it goes south to north, north to south, or sort of in the middle outwards. And then lots of the work that we do is more so based on the south to north because that will affect more people because it kind of fans out as it goes up the South Island. And just the way the Alpine Fault lies, if it did happen to come north to south, it's still technically then going a bit offshore. So the fanning that way is probably going to affect more like, Christchurch, Nelson, Wellington, pretty large population areas. So there is a program called the AF8 program, and Emergency Management Southland does the administration for it. Have an absolutely wonderful program manager, Alice Lake Hammond. She's actually based in Nelson, and it is funded by all 6 South Island civil defence groups, and is just a really excellent example of collaboration across an island. The North Island did have a not dissimilar program, but it wasn't coordinated by all of the civil defence groups in it, and it's now no longer in existence. So the AF8 program has been running for many years. It's got its own website, so people can have a look at the storybook. It's all very well done. Explains how it was discovered way back in the day, and then there's the safer framework, which has also been published, and that's looking at where the roads are going to be affected, electricity. Like, it's quite a substantial book. And so while we have our regional groups like our critical infrastructure, etc., we also have our AF8 groups. So that's that cross-boundary work. So like Southland and Otago, we've got a joint fuel plan. And for Southland, we're at the end of the road, so anything we want has to come through Otago if we're wanting, grocery distribution from Christchurch, etc. So we need to be able to work with our neighbours at that. We're not, it's not going to be a standalone event. It's going to be a whole country event.
Yeah.
So we need to know what each other's capabilities are and how we can work well together and help each other, because by the modelling, this is where we go, fingers crossed, by the modelling, Southland will feel it, but will be less affected than the likes of Otago and Canterbury. So it may be a case while we receive in the supplies, etc., and push them up, we may then become the refuge, if we have to evacuate Queenstown people south, etc., to assist our other regions to look after their people.
So is the website the only way of finding information about this? Is there a way that you all go out and actually communicate this wider to the general public?
No, we do a roadshow.
Right.
Go around the South Island every 2 years.
Yeah.
So we had the roadshow down here in Southland, did talks in Te Anau, Gore and Invercargill this time. Also visit a couple of schools. And Alice, it's a mammoth undertaking. She travels through each region, does 2, 3, 4 talks in each region, plus visiting a few of the schools. She'll call in supporting scientists. We have a lead scientist and many others that support all the different parts of work that are being done. And they will come to each of the talks around the countryside. And so she's been doing that the last 5, 6 weeks. Yeah.
Wow. It's a huge amount of work.
Yep. And just, a lot of national recognition as well, because it's such a standout program. And so if we've got national conferences on, Alice can come do a part, basically explain it. When even down at our level, for our inductions, just for our council staff members, because there is still lots of people that aren't necessarily aware of it, we'll explain what the Alpine Fault program is too.
So if the fault line ruptures somewhere in the next, I don't know, year or something, would you say all of the planning that has gone in terms of being prepared, we can actually get into effect if that happens?
Yes, I'm like, there's always more planning to be done, right? You can dial right down. Like we've recently did a priority routes project. So essentially, if you have one digger, that's what was put to us by NZTA. If you have one digger, what's the first road you open in Southland? And then they went to Otago, and they went to Canterbury. And then we had to start comparing maps, because we're like, what if we didn't open the same road to join each other? So how do you open your region? So some of those plans have been done. Otago's done a much bigger, almost like a catastrophic plan. Like, what's the air plan? How do we look after these pockets? Geographically, they have their east coast, like Dunedin, etc., but they've got their central lakes. So Queenstown will be cut off from Wanaka, that'll be cut off from Alex, So what's those bigger plans? And so they've done workshops. What does it look like if we have to evacuate or if we have to get supplies in? So again, you work collectively on the larger plan, and then you've got to work regionally on what the details are for how you're going to pull that off. And depending which organisation, NZTA is a New Zealand organisation versus the local district council that might only have a handful in their roading team. So, it depends what's scalable with what resources you have as well. So I think we also had a national exercise, say end of last year. Time flies. And they chose AF8 as the exercise. So it was really testing those national systems and how nationally would we respond, because something like that happening would very much be on the worldwide stage, and at a bigger scale than Christchurch. And so our Australian buddies, you look at Christchurch earthquake, we had Australia, Japan, various countries put their hands up to come help. Or if we've got quite a high tourist base in New Zealand. We're quite a tourist destination. So a lot of countries will be interested in getting their nationals out really quickly as well. So it's to have all of those national relationships built also.
Yeah, definitely. From your I guess, experience in New Zealand as a whole, what would you say is the most, oh, how can I put it? The biggest disaster that we should be worried about here, potentially? Is it a tsunami? Is it an earthquake? Well, an earthquake would really cause a tsunami, wouldn't it? But
Maybe.
what, maybe, yeah.
New
But what,
Zealand, I guess there's a couple I'll pick on outside of Southland. The Hikurangi Fault off the
what's
east
that?
coast of the North Island. The Hikurangi Fault off the east coast of the North Island. Think like Japan tsunami.
Mm,
Because the subduction zone is so close to land, there's not going to be a chance for official warning. I mean, even for us here in Southland, if something's half an hour away, that's still not necessarily long enough for official warning. But up there, it could be 10, 20 minutes.
wow.
And population wise, the east coast of the North Island's got a considerably, you think Napier, Hawke's Bay, etc., and the potential wraparound to Wellington or potentially also down to Christchurch Way.
Mm,
So that will be one of, or the New Zealand's biggest disaster if that goes. That I think that's sitting at about a 26% chance of happening in the next 50 years.
mm-hmm,
The Kermadec region above New Zealand is quite niggly for earthquakes. So there may be, I'll say low level, less than 1 metre high tsunami risk coming from there. But the Hikurangi is definitely high risk. And then Auckland. Auckland's sitting on a bunch of volcanoes. Who would build a city on a bunch of volcanoes? So I don't know if you've ever seen a plan on how you evacuate 1.5 million people,
no, I haven't.
but that's a lot. It makes 100,000 in Southland not seem quite so painful. So yeah, if a volcano starts niggling in Auckland, that's going to be an issue.
Yeah, where will they all go?
And then where will they all go? It's
Mm,
Auckland Emergency Management. They've got to work that one out.
mm.
Over a fifth of New Zealand's population. But from within Southland, which feels kind of unfair because it's on the edge of Southland, there's been quite a lot in the media lately about a landslide tsunami in Milford Sound. So that is taking quite a bit of our attention, and there's a lot of work to be done in that space because it's so unpredictable.
Mm.
And it could be the Alpine Fault that causes it. The Alpine Fault could have many aftershocks, and it could be one of those that causes it, or it actually could just be it could be an earthquake from a whole other fault that causes a landslide tsunami, or just land letting go, um, because the fjords are so steep, um, and there's nearly 1 million visitors a year go there. Something like 1 in 3 people that come to New Zealand go to Milford
Mm.
Sound. So the international um, media that will generate will very, very much damage our tourism sector if something goes wrong in there.
So a lot to think about for us, and a lot to be, I would say, more aware of, to be prepared for, really, in New Zealand. It's a beautiful place, but obviously, as all places are, there's always something that,
This is why it's so beautiful, right? We have our mountains, our
yeah,
beautiful mountains, because of our tectonic plates and earthquakes. And, we're an island. So being an island saved us during COVID, but being an island doesn't save you from tsunami, especially when we're a wee dot in the bottom of the Pacific. So there's lots of things. We're lush and green. We're so fortunate. I think we're one of a few amount of countries in the world that could actually be self-sustaining when it comes to food, because we can grow crops here, fertile land, heaps and heaps of water, but also, yeah, too much of a good thing sometimes is not good for us.
yeah. Well, thank you so much for allowing us to delve into your mind and to explore your experience and your expertise. One thing I like to do is ask the guest to leave us with something, some words, whether it's a quote, whether it's something just that we can chew on and think about moving forward. So is there anything you'd like to leave the Kaleidoscope Mind with?
Yes, I wish you had told me this. And I was at work
That the whole
because it's a
point
quote
isn't
on
to
my
tell you it
wall.
in advance.
I know, but the quote's on my wall. I love saying it. I need to think now. Do you know how many times I say this in training courses as well? I'll have to flag it. I'll just have to go with the preparedness messaging. Two main preparedness, drop, cover, and hold for earthquakes. If it's long or strong, get gone for tsunami. And preparedness doesn't have to be massive, right? Make a plan, have a chat with your family, buy that extra can of baked beans, clean out that empty bottle of Coke, fill it up with water. Start small. Anything prepared is better than nothing prepared.